Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over a match from round 6 of the 2014 Candidates Tournament. Our featured players today, White's going to be played by Shak, as we call him, and then Black's going to be played by Peter Svidler, who's kind of had an up and down tournament so far. As I was looking at all the games that were played today, I thought this one would be the most interesting because it's a defense that we don't see very often. We got to see the Dutch defense. Pawn here to f5 again. Pretty unusual, in my opinion, to see it at this stage in the candidates tournament here. I could potentially see it at maybe a smaller tournament where Peter Svidler is really above everyone else, but playing against best players in the world, this is pretty risky. He was definitely prepared in this opening, which is always good. My guess is he wouldn't play it if he wasn't, but still very interesting play from Peter Svidler in this position to have such a weakness here. But again, the Dutch defense can be pretty lethal if your opponent's not up to the task of playing against it. Shak plays pawn here to g3, definitely one way to attack it, kind of the Leningrad system where you play pawn to g3, you fianchetto, and then you play knight here to f3, solidifying your king side safety over here, and it's a nice little way to counterattack the light squares in the center of the board, which Black is trying to attack with his pawn here on f5. So we'll continue with knight to f6, bishop here to g2, pawn to g6, knight to f3 as we talked about, bishop to g7, fianchettoing here on the king side, castle, and then we have castle. All these moves somewhat expected from both sides. White now starts to expand on the queen side. He's pretty much done everything he needs to do on the king side. He wants to get his dark square bishop out before he plays something like a pawn to e3, so he wants to kind of hold on to that as long as possible. So really his only move is to go ahead and start pushing on the queen side, get his knight involved into the game, see what his opponent does. His opponent, on the other hand, kind of wants to do the same thing, wants to maybe potentially start to attack in the center of the board. His king side is developed. He definitely wants to get his light square bishop involved into the game, his knight involved, and then again see what Shak does playing as white. So we have pawn here to d6, opening up the door for the light square bishop, also allowing for the pawn to push forward to e5, putting another defender on that square right now. Knight to c3, again, all pretty common moves from both sides. Queen to e8, it's kind of a waiting move. It's not doing too much since the pawn moves forward here to d6. It does have an outlet here for these light squares, but again, this move here on queen e8 isn't doing too much. White decides to go for the pretty aggressive line, and that's pawn here to b4, pushing forward. He's just going to really put as much pressure as he can on his opponent with these pawns on the queen side. Now pawn to e5, trying to break up the center of the board. We see the pawn take, now the pawn take, and then bishop here to a3. Now a few different options that White had in this particular case. You know, he's looking for the discovered attack with pawn here to b5. He didn't have to necessarily play bishop there to a3. He could have played knight to d5. This again is pretty aggressive, attacking the center of the board. If Peter Svidler decides to take, he could either have a pawn here, he could play the very aggressive queen takes, attacking the king. He could even push forward with pawn to e4. Even though we have the pawn take, knight take, we can now have the queen come up here, d5 check, and we'd recapture this material back. So White doesn't lose any material in this position. So definitely had options in the particular game, decided to go ahead and play bishop here to a3, looking for that discovered attack with pawn here to b5. We now see pawn pushing forward to e4, forcing the knight to move. The knight's going to come over here, d4, centralizing. Doesn't want to move too far out from the rest of the field. Again, White is really trying to control the center and attack from the queen side, so it definitely wants to make sure he has as many pieces as possible in the attack. Rook to f7, again, doesn't want to have to deal with this pawn here to b5. And then we see queen here to b3, kind of opening up the door for pawn to c5 if he wants to. He still has the pawn to b5, threatening this long diagonal. So just getting all his pieces in motion in case Black kind of slips up. Knight to c6, again, developing his pieces. White decides to go ahead and trade off. Again, he had moved this knight away from f3, so trading it doesn't do too much harm. Now we see pawn pushing forward, attacking, opening up this long diagonal. So this rook is kind of awkwardly placed. He would really like to double it up, maybe with his rook here on d8, d7, control this long open file right here. The queen's going to come back to e8 after it's being attacked. Pawn pushing forward to f3. Pretty much putting to the test this pawn here on f4, also stopping any attack of knight to g4, which could get pretty awkward in white's position right here. Now we see the bishop come to e6. Again, now black has pretty much completed his development. Both sides have completed development. So again, just getting involved into the action. Rook to d1, again, trying to control these long files. That's exactly what white wants to do. And then black decides to kind of counterattack on the queen side. He plays pawn here to a6. Then we see the capture and then the recapture with the rook here on a6. Realizing that he can't just bring it over here to d8, instead decides to go ahead and put pressure on this bishop here on a3. Now we see the capture for this pawn on e4, and then the capture, and then the capture, and we can see white ends up going up in material, but black does have a nice counterplay, and that is pawn here to b5. If we just look at this before, we could say, white actually came up on top, but after pawn to b5, black's going to win that material. There's just too much pressure right here. White can't take with his pawn because his queen's going to fall, and he can't just move it at all because then the queen would fall. So again, this pawn is going to end up taking, or the bishop could end up taking. Black's going to get that material back. So in this particular case, if we look at it, I would say it's about equal. Both sides have the same material. They both have the double bishop pair on an open board, so they can pretty much control a lot of the action. It really just comes down to if one side slips up or not. But again, there's no clear-cut winner right now. Queen now moves to e3, again being attacked, so it gets out of the way. Pawn taking on c4. We now have passed pawns on c4 and e2. Black's obviously a lot closer, but he does have doubled pawns. Something for white to keep in mind if he wants to attack later on. Bishop here to c5. Centerline this bishop, also opening up the door for a potential trap. This pawn is now open for attacking, but it would actually be a pretty big mistake, one that many players would fall into. But after the rook were to take here on a2, then we nice see a deflection with bishop here to d5. This bishop here on e6 can't do a whole heck of a lot. It can't move because of the pin. Even if it tries to move back, the queen could just take here on e8. The bishop can no longer take because, again, it's still pinned. Even in this position, even if the rook comes back here to a6, trying to protect this bishop, now the bishop can take here on c4, attacking both the rook and the bishop. We still have the pin right here. The rook can come to c6 and try to hold down the fort since it's not being attacked. But after bishop here to b5, pinning this rook down to the queen, it just gets pretty ugly for black. White's going to have a pretty easy game from here. So after bishop there to c5, we see the queen come over here to c8. Definitely wants to make sure that there's no crazy pins going on where he could lose his queen, but he still wants to keep it on these light squares since that's where his most central bishop is. We now see pawn to h4 again, putting a lot of pressure on the king side. He can start marching up the board, and from here is kind of where it all fell apart. Black plays pawn to h6, and usually you don't see this type of poor play at this stage, but black just pretty much just left this pawn hanging here on g6. After the bishop takes on g6, there's no way to get that material back. As you approach the end game, you can't give material back unless you have something in return for it. Black actually has nothing in return. It was just a pretty poor play. Peter Svidler said that his mind just didn't work for about 20 minutes. This was in that 20-minute span. And so, again, from here, Shak was just able to play few moves out. It didn't take long from here. So bishop here to d5, pawn to h5, protecting. Nice little outpost for this bishop. Now the queen's going to come to d7, bishop back here to d4. White's pretty much okay with just going down to the end game because he is up in material right here. Rook over here to e6, bishop to f7. Again, pretty okay with exchanging. Queen taking, decides to go ahead and take. Now after the rook comes here to g7, again it is being protected by this bishop, and the king moves. Then we have the last devastating move, and that is rook here to g5. really brilliant last move by Shak, because it really puts black in a tough spot. Peter Svidler was forced to resign in this particular case, but to kind of go through, what would happen if the pawn takes here on g5. We could now see the bishop take here on e3. If you look at the squares on the board where each side would promote to, the white pawn would come to h8. Because black does not have a dark square bishop, there's no great way to defend this. If you look at black, his passed pawn here on c4 is going to a c1, which is a dark square. White has a dark square bishop, so he can kind of defend this. So even though white's up in material, it could be stopped if black had the right square bishop, but he does not. He has his light square bishop, and that's definitely going to be a huge factor. So this would be very difficult for black. He would obviously lose this game. Even if we come back in this particular case, the bishop, if he really moves, it really doesn't matter where he goes. Let's say he just comes back here to c6. Then again, the bishop could take here on e3. Black would be forced to capture, and then the bishop could take here on g5. This would definitely be very bad. If the rook decides to move instead, we could see something. It doesn't want to come here to e5 because it would just fall to the bishop. But if it moves anywhere else, even if it were to take here on e2, then the rook's just going to swing over, capture this bishop here on d5. All of a sudden, black's down even more material. So no great way for black to really continue in this spot. Going into the end game, white just has a much better game. He realizes that this pawn right here is going to be a huge asset. There's just no way for black to stop it. So Shak was not prepared for the Dutch defense, he said, but he played extremely well as white. At the end of the game, Peter Svidler just made, in my opinion, just a careless mistake. That's what happens sometimes in the chess tournament. You've been playing for 6 days now in the 6th round. I guess 7th day they had a break, but his brain was just probably fried for a short amount of time, made a small mistake, and it cost him the game. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Always fun to do commentary on games like the Dutch defense. Stay tuned for more coverage, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.